I'm gonna do the lecture. And Nicos is gonna We should start.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. My name is Nicholas Nicoli. I am an associate professor at the University of Nicosia's Department of Communications. I would like to welcome the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor Nicos, esteemed colleagues, friends, guests, and students, welcome. And of course, to all of our digital audiences who are here with us via our live stream link, welcome to all of you. From all corners of the world, I hear, so a nice crowd. Before we begin, we have a nice surprise that I only just heard of today myself. I want to invite here to the stage one of the most creative lyricists and writers in Cyprus today. Giulio Gomboloi is a Cypriot rapper, and he will perform for us before we proceed with the book launch. Giulio?
Ελληνικά.
Ό,τι θέλεις.
Καλησπέρα σας. Είμαι ο Τζούλιο. Καταρχήν ευχαριστώ τον Mike για την special ευκαιρία που μου διά. Ο Mike ήταν έμπνευση για όλους μας στην Κύπρο. Ένα πολύ σημαντικό άτομο για την τέχνη που κάνουμε. Να μπορούσα να τον αποκαλέσω η προϊστορία της τέχνης μας σε μια ζωντανή ιστορία που ακόμα διάμασε. Ζήτησε μου να το ανοίξω με κάτι δικό μου και μια πολύ καλή ευκαιρία να σας πω ένα ραπ χωρίς beat, χωρίς μουσική, χωρίς τίποτε, γιατί οι στίχοι μεταφέρονται διαφορετικά, άμα παρουσιάζονται διαφορετικά. Τούτον είναι το τούτος ο κόσμος. Και λέει παπούτσια πεταμένα πας στα σύρματα, βρωμένοι και αντρωμένοι πας στα χτίσματα, λαμπάδες που στα 12 επαντρέψαντες και σβήσαν, μανάες που είναι μωρά και έχουν μωρά που περπατήσαν, ξυπόλυτες κυρίες, ρακένδυτοι λεβέντες, τα αδέρφια μας κοιμούνται μες σε τέντες, γιώνουν στα καταφύγια και μες σε κέντρα κράτησης και σέρνονται απόκληροι στα δίχτυα της κατάθλιψης. Πέ μου θωρείς τους, θαμώνες του περιθωρίου, κομπάρσι μες στο κόλπο πίσω κόλλες του βιβλίου, που βρέφει μες σε φάπρικες, φακούν υπερορίες, 8χρονα με ζάσταβα και φιλισεφατρίες. Πλάσματα που δεν τους έδωκεν το σύμπαν ευκαιρίες. Μωρά παναγιωθήκαν μέσα σε εχθροπραξίες. Εξόριστοι του κόσμου. Άλλοι θύματα της Δύσης. Η αλήθεια εμπροβάλλεται ούτε υπόψε στις ειδήσεις. Και εσύ γυρεύκεις την ασφάλεια σου βλάκα. Νομίζεις πως μπορείς να ζεις ανέγκυχτος για πάντα. Άκου, είσαι ο επόμενος, κι ας με παίρνεις χαπάρι. Είσαι σαν το χαβιάρι, κι όπου να σε λήφκιο ψάρι. Σιφτοί μικροαστοί, σχολάνουν με τις δουλειές του και πιένουν για να πέσουν. Μιτσοί, που εφάς τη μούρη της ζωή, θωρούν τους που τα τέγια και σ' αρέσουν, περιπέζουν. Τι να του πεις του φίλου μου, μες στο καμπουνίπιο και φέτος κλείτα 10. Πέ μου, νομίζεις είσαι εσύ σκληρός. Εγώ λαλώ είσαι λίος, μπρο. Μπροστά του εμπιάνεις πένα. Τώρα ξέρεις γιατί εψαρώνω. Είδα γυμνών τον πόνο και μου ντζίζουν ποιον οι ράπερς. Μαγκώνω μπροστά στον άνθρωπο και μόνο. Τι να μου πουν οι ράπερς σου λιτούτοι, motherfuckers. Εγώ ξέρω ότι τούτος ο κόσμος άλλα δείχνει και άλλα είναι. Άλλοι στα πούπουλα και άλλοι μπας στα κάρβουνα. Εσύ αν θέλεις τη σιωπή για πάντα μείνε. Εγώ δεν μπορώ να συνυπάρξω με τα άβουλα. Θυμούμε, τούτος ο κόσμος άλλα δείχνει και άλλα είναι. Άλλοι είμαστε στα πούπουλα και άλλοι μπας στα κάρβουνα. Εσύ αν θέλεις τη βολή για πάντα μείνε. Εγώ δεν μπορώ να σιουρκαστώ, αγαπώ τα άβολα. Ευχαριστώ.
Julio, ladies and gentlemen. So, no more need to wait in vain. There is a natural mystic in the air. And we are here for the book launch of Dr. Mike Hajimichael. The book is titled Bob Marley and Media, Representations and Audiences. And I have had a chance to go over the book this week, and it really is a meticulous ethnographic study of the artist, the singer, the man, Bob Marley, and of course how he was represented in legacy media, but even probably more importantly, why that is still significant today. Ultimately, I think it really is a reflection of the power, the analytical power of cultural studies, particularly when it comes to audiences. Of course, this doesn't surprise me because I have known Dr. Hajimichael for a good part of 20 years or so. And what can I say? He is very passionate about his research and he works tirelessly on his research, and that's, we all know who works close with him. But I think also it's important to note that maybe a lot of you will not know this, but Dr. Hajimichael is a PhD graduate from the University of Birmingham's Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. And this is the birthplace of cultural studies in the late 50s and 60s in the UK. So his roots are where they should be in cultural studies. And, you know, this is a center that was created by scholarly giants such as Richard Hogarth and Raymond Williams, and of course, the late Stuart Hall, the Jamaican Brit sociologist who directed the center at some point. So allow me, Mike, to be the first to congratulate you on this colossal achievement. This book launch at the University of Nicosia is part of a 2023 worldwide promotional tour with events happening in Sweden, Lithuania, the UK, and the USA. You're gonna invite me to those as well.
Yeah, of course. You're doing a good job.
Bob Marley and Media, Representation and Audiences illustrates Dr. Hajimichael's cultural, creative, and academic work. In his teaching, Dr. Hajimichael has developed a number of innovative courses such as Internet Radio, Internet TV, and popular music, culture, and media, where students engage in the making of pre-recorded and live content on the Internet through the use of innovative augmented production tools on digital platforms. These courses are unique to the University of Nicosia's Department of Communications. More recently, Dr. Hajimichael has been engaged with the impact of AI technology on creative practice and AI research processes and app development relating to media literacy and fake news content. Other than his academic work, Dr. Hajimichael, as many of you will know, is a performance poet, a recording artist, a radio presenter, and freelance writer. These experiences have enhanced and informed his writing and research for the last 2 decades. Dr. Hajimichael is particularly interested in media representation, reggae, arts and social justice, media literacy, citizens media, and colonial writing and text. He also produces a weekly radio show called The Outer Nationalist, which is played on 3 stations in different countries, which I do urge you to listen to if you haven't already. Dr. Hajimichael was recently invited via the Institute of Caribbean Studies to deliver the 26th annual Bob Marley lecture in Jamaica at the University of the West Indies, emphasizing the significance of this book, of his latest book. And with that, I think it's a good time to turn to the 2 book reviews. Starting first with Dr. Dennis Howard. Dr. Howard is an ethnomusicologist from the Institute of Caribbean Studies at the University of the West Indies in Kingston, Jamaica. And he is here with us via Zoom to give his book review. Dr. Howard, are you with us?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm right here.
The floor is yours.
Pardon me?
The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I want just congratulate Hajimichael, as I call him, on this outstanding book, a book that was well needed and a book that was supposed to be done a long time ago, but it's better late than never. And I'm really, uh, elated that it was done by my friend, Dr. Hajimichael. And I'll say that from a Jamaican perspective, significant because it is, as a cultural studies scholar myself, the ethnographic uh, rigor that comes across in this book is absolutely amazing. And from a Jamaican standpoint, where we sometimes in Jamaica, as victims of the colonial design, have this notion that Bob Marley was only accepted by Jamaicans only when the rest of the world, meaning white world, accepted him. And it is an absolute falsehood which has never been articulated in terms of scholarship as it is in this volume. And so it was so significant that as a colleague and as a friend and as a co-worker, when it came time for the Bob Marley lecture, I suggested that Hajimichael be the guest. And it's interesting, we tried to move away from having the lecture be about Bob Marley. It is named in his honor, but we don't really encourage year after year that the lecture be about Bob Marley or associated with Bob Marley. But in this case, the director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies was absolutely elated and saw this book after my recommendation and also getting a preview of the book in terms of reading a couple of the chapters. He was absolutely, on board for this year's Bob Marley lecture to be about the book. And so I think that this book is going to be outstanding volume in terms of Marley literature, which sometimes are left wanting, to say the least. But this will be among the better literature that talks about Bob Marley and its unique perspective and the details that it goes into and the rigor and the analytical skills that Dr. Hajimichael employed in this volume is amazing, and I really congratulate him for this effort. And we in Jamaica are endorsing this book, and we were very happy to have him at the very prestigious Bob Marley lecture this year. Thank you very much. And once again, congratulations, Hajimichael.
It's the internet in Jamaica.
Yeah, it could be the internet. Thank you, Doctor, if you can hear us. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Howard. Now for the second book review, I'd like to turn to our colleague here at the University of Nicosia. He is a professor of sociology, Professor Nicos Trimikliniotis, who has with him Lucas aid in order to refresh him, to loosen his tongue a bit. Nicos, the floor is yours.
Whiskey.
Dear Mike, dear friends, dear colleagues, Professor Florian here, Professor Ron, thank you for coming here.
I'm honored to present the latest book by my good friend and colleague, Professor Mike Hajimichael, Bob Marley Media and Representation Audiences. This book is an achievement on different grounds and levels. It bridges the gap between academia and popular culture, music and sociology, politics and art, locality and globality. Mike brings to town in the present a ghostly spirit which has never quite left us and continues to inspire. On this rather strange evening, March evening, I will say just a few words about how Mike has brought to us Bob Marley to Nicosia in our own concrete jungle, which is harshly competitive and dangerous in its own specific ways. In a world which is our own liquid world. The book is a wonderful read. It's lively, it's real, it's authentic, and I enjoy it from cover to cover. Highly accessible, not just for academics, scholars, or Malay and reggae fundamentalists. It is a fascinating read to read a book, contemporary book written about what happened, about something that has been in the last 40 years after the death of Marley, shedding light on this iconic symbol and learn new facts, revealing new perspectives, not just about then, but about now, and especially about the future. The future here and the future of the world. As the author aptly knows, we're referring to an exceptionally talented human being who contributed significantly during his lifetime to changing a world that was so unjust, inhumane, and aggressive. He continues to contribute in so many ways, inspiring people throughout the world. This is what Professor Hajimichael says in the book. Now, let me put my academic hat on, even though I cannot quite take off the other hat that I wear. It is a revelation to appreciate that a book can be written in a way that combines a popular readership, open for everyone, that contains insights, the kind of ideas and richness from a cultural studies and media studies perspective, in that it addresses issues relating to music, the music industry, reggae, class, race, racism, prejudice, inequality, coloniality, post-coloniality in the world system as we live today. With Mike, I am surprised, as he notes in the book, that despite the hundreds of books written about Marley, more than 700 he has found, essentially biographical, the vast majority of which are sensationalist and unreliable, often loaded with exaggeration and fake news, posthumely deifying Bob Marley as a god or prophet, or making up stories about his life and his encounter. Only a handful of serious scholarly work of this great artist are to be found, of someone who rose from the ghettos of Trenchtown, 1950s housing project for the Kingston poor, to rise to become an iconic global symbol up to in the short life that he lived, up to his 30s. But he never gave up hoping, conveying the message by his art and life. Stuart Hall, already referred to by my esteemed colleague here, is another Jamaican giant, founder of cultural studies. In his autobiographical Familiar Stranger, suggests that Marley's lyrics are inspired by the notorious ghettos, I'm quoting, like Trenchtown and Tivoli Street Gardens, the no-go garrison centers of rival political factions, petty and organized criminal activities. After all, Bob Marley's own verse, we have all hummed at one time or another, is telling, in this great future, you cannot forget your past. This is a wonderful way that Mike's opens the book as verse 1. This short, 130-page long book is a condensed text made of 7 verses, which represent tracks on 2 sides of vinyl records, each one addressing different aspects of Marley's life via the interaction and representations of the audience, of the media, and the audience reaction to it. Verse 1, in this great future you cannot forget the past, is a general introduction. It rightly starts with Marley's own fascinating journey from the moment he had heard about Marley's death back in 1981. A student then in multicultural but highly polarized and racialized London. The book is the pinnacle of his academic work that connects intellectually the threads of his own life. The musician artist known as Hajimichael, who has played a formative role, as we have heard from Giulio himself, who is the best of in his generation, as far as I'm concerned, on how in formative role in creating music and art scene in Cyprus. The DJ and lover of reggae, the activist intellectual since the return to Cyprus some 30 years ago, with the colorful and unconventional professor with whom I shared an office for a few years, teaching cultural studies at the University of Nicosia.
Are you later?
Born in Cyprus, but growing up in London in the late 60s, early 70s, and particularly the Thatcherite 80s, with Marley becoming massive then, particularly after his untimely death, Mike embarks on a long media studies journey. His PhD was on the representation of Cyprus and Cypriots at the famous Center of Contemporary Cultural Studies. And at this point, I want to mention that Mike has been instrumental in opening up the debates in Cyprus about how do we honor someone like George Michael in Cyprus? What are we doing? Not only have a name, a street name after him named. And when he did raise it, exactly in the same way that Marley was treated by the media, George Michael is treated as a junkie, a homosexual junkie who should not be given a name after him by the official historian of the CYBC, reflecting more or less how Marley was treated by the BBC in some ways or another. So history repeats itself, it seems. First of the tragedy, I won't say the rest. So another famous Jamaican, of course, would be crucial in Mike's formative ideas. And I think he opens up conversations with Stuart Hall here, who has made so much, who has created and opened up the discussion around decoding how ideology shapes messages and how the media selectively and systematically advances narratives and meanings while silencing, marginalizing, racializing, and other times exoticizing and criminalizing others. Representation is neither neutral nor objective in the media. It is, according to Hall, constitutive. I will come back to this. However, as Mike shows in this book, the relation with audiences is a highly complex one. It is diverse, contradictory, and despite the manipulation for marketing or profiteering or political interest, different representations, intentional, unintentional, or contextual, result in different outcomes. It is a terrain of struggle. And as Stuart Hall has taught us, what popular struggles matter, popular studies matter. Verse 2, much mix-up, is a masterful cut across the literature, critically examining the sorting of what is useful and what is not in the various genres of Marleyology in the textual industry. This requires serious cutting through the bullshit, I would say, but also creatively sewing in the insightful analysis that can be drawn from various works on Marley. Mike is rightly critical of most biographical works, which is produced opportunistically to exploit the commodified Marley, who emerged after his death. But Mike illustrates that trying to put together the story of Marley prior to embarking on analysis to his representation is no easy task, because in Mike's words, it is Marley is a complicated human puzzle. And the contradictory readings of who Marley was and what he meant then and what he means now is indicative that he means different things to different people, from a popular music icon to a revolutionary singer to a recommodified product with incredible sales records. So we're dealing here with a highly complex phenomenon. But Mike does not get trapped in some kind of postmodern relativism where everything goes and everything means nothing and everything at the same time. He does not stop at recognizing the polysemic nature of Marley's songs or Marley's message, or the media obsession, which is not devoid of ideological meanings about the great rise to the top in a short lifetime of this person. Let's not forget he died a young man of 36. In one lifetime, Mike notes, Marley leapt from a country boy to a worldwide icon, musical icon. And he sets out to explore this enigmatic, unique, popular icon. And he asks the question, do these commercialized consuming masses comprehend the intricacies of his Rasta worldview despite their familiarity with his songs popularizing the Legend compilation, which was of course compiled after his death to make it kind of better for the ear or everyone to become much more bigger. So it's a popular figure. And this is where he brings in a bit of sociology. And I want to kind of keep your attention here, because he says that Marley is an example of the sociological term intersectionality par excellence. This is how we should understand this. So factors need to be understood in terms of his experiences, his vocal resistance through songs to different forms of oppression. Marley is not a singular entity. His multivocality, visionary songs, and polysemy raised challenges about how he was being portrayed and how different works have reflected upon him. So we're dealing here, in Mike's words, with a revolutionary, an artist who progressed from a village in Jamaica to be known throughout the world, a product refrained time and time again to reap more profits for multinational music companies, which often leads to the equation reggae equals Bob Marley. So in this sense, Marley is an open book, he says, and he should be interpreted in different ways. I'm so glad that in the audience we have today Professor Florian Thiers, who was, of course, my PhD supervisor, and one of the pioneers of the field of sociology, developing ideas around complex interrelations between and articulations of gender, race, ethnicity, class, and migration. I would argue, with Florian, Mike here, that the study of Bob Marley would benefit once we appreciate that representations, readings, and meanings of Marley as a prime instance of what Flora would call translocational positioning and exclusion from a perspective that takes that into account. Flora would set out to ask the following questions. How do various dimensions of difference and inequality, such as gender, race, ethnicity, migration, coloniality, etc., play out in society? And I think Marley is a prime example of how we should understand this. Studying Marley is indicative of how the production and reproduction of social relations of difference and inequality, which move beyond the standard categories of difference and their intersections, allow us to consider processes by which they are made and unmade within broader systems of power in modern societies. That's how the system operates. And you have seen this through the concrete example of how Bob Marley is understood. Today, 40 years since the death of Bob Marley, we can appreciate the meaning of struggles, the articulations of emancipation, the uses and abuses of representation, and how audience have produced alternative forms of social knowledge. in a world whereby difference is, on the one hand, discursively celebrated. Oh, it's so lovely to be different. We hear day after day through different slogans and marketing kind of strategies and European Union gimmicks. But on the other hand, we are living and we're witnessing a world of growing racism, growing sexism, different forms of classism and violence, and inequality in neoliberal capitalism. And we are living through this contradiction. So the meaning of what Marley said, get up, stand up, fight for your rights today, acquires a new meaning in context, not out of context. That's why Marley still inspires. So Mike is right that Marley means different things to different people. But the key point, which he underlines from the beginning to the end, is that he has remained vital in the struggle against inequalities and injustice. And I think this is really the key to understanding the work of Bob Marley and what Mike has done in this context. Now, in the 21st century Nicosia, that we are faced with, and those studying cultural studies will know that social sciences, those studying cultural studies, social science will know that the field of cultural production is so closely linked with wider cultural, political, and social realities, the polarization and contestation of society. And culture is not the privilege of the few. In a broad sense, it talks about it is about a way of life. For artistic creation, this refers to social actions, performances that give meaning and value to the way of life of individuals and social groups of society. We heard Giulio today perform. Tell us something about the social magma of Cypriot society and how this can be a critical edge from which we can understand society and how to change it, which is really the key to it. He insists on a very important point. He says that Marley must be seen as an organic intellectual in the Caribbean context, which is a good description of different other revolutionary thinkers and writers, people like Walter Rowman. And I think this is a very important point. And I would like this developed a lot more, Mike, for the next book you're doing, because it is perhaps a way to think of the world differently. Now, what he does is something interesting about the essential meaning of Bob Marley. His attraction to other cultural scholars, such as Gilroy, is to see who sees Marley as a revolutionary champion of the struggle for justice, peace, and human rights, but on the basis of an anti-political outlook, contra the unwanted and draining universal sufferation. That's the position of cultural theorists such as Paul Gilroy is. Now, Mike's own motto here is that to take the idea of Bob Marley, this sort of unpolitical or anti-political view, and to adapt it to the Cypriot context. And he will sing over and over again in different contexts, one Cyprus, one love, one Cyprus reunited. He would insist on this. However, and this is a slight criticism towards him, yes, which I would like him to respond. We need a politics of reconciliation. We need a politics of reunification that transcends the current politics rather than anti-politics. We need basically a new politics. And this is where politics must be redefined. And I take Ranciere's definition, Mike, who refuses that politics is about managing, is about controlling. He calls this police. Politics is about disagreeing. Politics is about contesting. Politics is about shaping something that is alternative. Otherwise, this idea of one love, one Cyprus, one world would be, sadly for those struggling for unification of the island or for the unification of the world, would be a noble idea, but only wishful thinking. So I don't think that we should stop there. Now, I don't have time to develop all of the points that Mike is making. I know that time is very short here, but the important point here is to see Bob Marley in Cyprus today. And Bob Marley in Cyprus in 2023 that we're living is to try and understand from the vantage point of a society which is a border society. And I think the fact that Mike Hajimichael, who grew up in London, moved to Cyprus, opened roads for rethinking and redoing art in Cyprus is a fascinating point to think about. It's fascinating because he brings his own immigrant background, his own understanding, this in-betweenness, to open spaces for people to think Cyprus again. I think this is crucial. And this perhaps is the hidden meaning of Cyprus, or of Bob Marley, or reading Bob Marley in 2023. If Cyprus, a post-colonial country which is divided in different geopolitical spheres, is more and quite different, it's in a different geopolitical sphere than post-colonial Jamaica, perhaps we can say something from the world from the point of view, from the vantage point we are standing. And I would quote Arisitas here, who said that Cyprus has been a living evidence used by a long line of American and British scholars to demonstrate that the East is East and the West is West. In the words of Rudyard Kipling, never the twain shall meet. Samuel Huntington had a new language for that. Cyprus is a fault line defined by the modern class of civilizations, where culture and differences make the fault lines into cracks and the cracks into unfathomable ravines. Where critical social scientists, scholars, and organic intellectuals like Mike Hajimichael see and articulate what there's about in a living experience as imaginary and real borders on the island, Huntington and his cohort of international relations experts see only cracks. The point is how to move beyond the cracks, how to move beyond this. And perhaps today, as Professor Hajimichael has illustrated in his book, and as I said, in the review, you can read about the other verses, the other set of verses. Now I have no time to expand on them. He illustrates in a materialist way, particularly in the last verse, verse 7, called Dapi Conqueror, where there is life after death. Of course, the Jamaican dual meaning of Dapi Conqueror here in the Whalers song is literally translated as the ghost conqueror, which implies Dapis, spirits, which haunt us by night. But also there is a deeper meaning to it, which is that of a different spirit, that of a fearless, us together struggling can overcome the obstacles and difficulties. And I think that would be an interesting point to start from. Mike, thank you very much for helping us listen to the natural mystic blowing in the air. So we need to listen carefully now, and we'll listen what to hear. And it seems that tonight, a spectre is haunting Nicosia, beamed and streamed through the world, the spectre of Bob Marley. Thank you very much.
Nicos, thank you very much for that wonderful book review. I think it's time we listen to the author now, who will share with us his thoughts on the book launch, on the book, and of course there will be opportunities later on for questions and answers if you have any, so please do keep that in mind. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Distinguished guests. It's very nice to see people in the audience that have inspired me, both academically and artistically and politically. I'm quite honored by your presence, by everybody's presence, from colleagues in the department and from students. And I'm very happy to see many of my students here tonight as well. This is a very special moment for me in my academic career, and I wanted to share some thoughts on the book Bob Marley, A Media Representation and Audiences, which has just been published by Rowman and Littlefield. It certainly has been a journey, and during that journey, something happened to all of us called COVID-19, which complicated my book in many ways. And speaking about it in different parts of the world has really been a milestone, for me. The fact that the first place I spoke about this was actually in Jamaica, as Dennis said earlier on. I was very humbled and honored to be invited to that very special lecture at the University of West Indies. There's a lot of people I would really like to thank who are here with us tonight. I really want to say a very special thank you to someone in the audience who, a lot of the time, the people that do the visual creativity in every aspect of culture, I'd like to thank him first, because I think a lot of the time the visual people are ignored. I want to say a very special thanks to my brethren, Konstantinos Pisurios, who's with us tonight, who designed the cover of the book. For me, it's a very special cover. It's a very special cover because I told him what I wanted to write about, and he understood it straight away. And the cover is very inspiring for me, what Konstantinos came up with. I'd like to thank the University of Nicosia for its support during the course of doing this research, and for the support that the university gave me in going to Jamaica. I want to say a very special thanks to the marketing team for doing such an excellent job of tonight's event, and also to Anthoulis, who's been very important in terms of the live stream. And again, the technicians as well as the visual people often get ignored. So that's why I want to say thanks to him. I'd like to say a very big thanks to all the people that have spoken before me. My colleague Nicholas from the Department of Communications, Dennis Howard, who through the wonders of modern technology could be with us tonight from the University of West Indies. And Dennis has been part of this process from the book proposal phase, basically. He's advised me and guided me through a lot of aspects about Bob Marley that I learned a lot from Dennis's very rich ethnomusicological knowledge. Because in Jamaica, every street corner has got a story to tell. And walking the streets with Dennis a few weeks ago while I was there, it was a very big inspiration for me to be there with someone who's such a learned, cultured person from Jamaica. I want to give a very special thanks to Professor Nicos Trimikliniotis, who's also being supportive throughout this process, and for his inspiring and fiery speech. Nicos has always been an inspiration to me, and he's a great orator. He's a great speaker. I'm not too sure. There's one thing that I wanted to take up with him about the anti-politics. Obviously, I want to say something about this, because I think what you're misunderstanding a little bit is that sometimes anti-politics is out of despair. And Jamaica was a place of huge political polarization, and it still is. And so that violence and that very tense environment that Marley was in produced that very Rastafarian outlook, which isn't just a Marley phenomenon. I agree with you, though, that you do need some sort of politics, but I believe in politics with a small p as an artist. I'm very tired of party politics, wherever that may be, because I find it very disappointing. A big thank you also goes out to the Faculty Union and Domino's Pizza, who are supporting our reception afterwards. I have to say these things, sorry. But I would like to say a very special thanks, and please join us for the reception afterwards, which is in the block next door, the restaurant next door. So I want to start I want to use this, which was lent to me by Nicholas. First time I'm using it. I wish I had this in Jamaica. I think it's going to work, yeah? There you go. Right. So as Nicos said, the structure of the book is based around 7 verses. I'm not going to explain these in depth, one by one. What I really wanted to do was focus more on the media content and a little bit on the chapter about life after death. I wanted to start by just going through some of the motivations for writing this book. First of all, I felt the need to revise media content on Bob Marley because it actually represents something. It doesn't represent one thing, it represents many things. But I felt that it was important to understand this from what Stuart Hall calls the constitutive aspect of representation. I mean, what does it mean? What does it represent was something that aroused my curiosity from a very long time ago. Not just as an academic, but also as a person who writes about reggae for music magazines. And it's often been said, and I say this to my students, that Elvis Costello once said the famous line, writing about music is akin to dancing about architecture, which, kind of makes my job as a music critic redundant. I totally disagree with Elvis Costello about this, obviously, because I wouldn't be here. But I think that there is something fundamentally going on when people talk about musicians. And there is something going on when the media is talking about musicians, and that really interests me. And I wanted to look for illuminating information about Marley. I think one of the things about Marley is there's so much information that's been recycled, as Nicos said, in biographic form. And I was just interested to find out a few things from media that maybe I might have even read in the 1980s or 1970s. A few things that probably passed me by. And there's literally a wealth of information that can be analyzed. I have to say a little bit about Jamaica, right? Because Jamaica 2023, it was such a special thing for me to give this very prestigious lecture in the birthplace of cultural studies in the Caribbean, which is the Institute of Caribbean Studies at the University of West Indies, UWI. UWI is one of the most top-ranked universities in the Caribbean and Latin America. And it's an amazing place. I've been there about 3 times now, mainly for conferences. And being invited to give this lecture was I felt very humbled by it. I felt very honored. And I also felt quite strange because 10 years ago, I was sitting in the audience watching someone give this lecture. And that someone was actually Alan Skill Cole, who was Bob Marley's first manager. So it was a bit strange, being asked, this academic from the University of Nicosia, whose book hadn't actually come out. The book came out when I was in Jamaica on the 13th or 15th of February. And I was speaking about it on the 17th of February. So it was a big honor for me. And Jamaica is always, as I said, a very lived experience, culturally, musically. Every day was a surprise. And for me, this was like the trip of a lifetime. I've been all over the world, musically and academically, but this 1 week, every single day, something very special happened. And it was it was just a great experience for me to be able to interact with people in Jamaica about this book and about some of the thoughts that are beyond the book, which relate a lot more to the representation of Marley as this wild man of pop, and also making connections with Stuart Hall, which I'm not going to talk too much about because Nicos has covered it very well. So it was a great inspiration to me, this trip. And of course, when I went to Jamaica, I had to explain what's going on. I mean, I'm coming from Cyprus, and in a way, I've got to explain this again tonight because I'm here in Cyprus talking about Bob Marley, and it does seem a little bit strange, but it is a testament to the impact of Marley's music that 10,638 kilometers away from us now on the island of Jamaica, Bob Marley was born, and his music is a testament to his legacy, and the music went all over the world, and it came to Cyprus too. Anywhere you go in the world, you will find Bob Marley's messages. You'll also find a lot of things like, you know, the Bob Marley beach towels in jumbo and things like this. But those things to me are the more commercialized aspects of Marley's existence culturally. And I think it's really important that to make this link, as Nicos did during his very eloquent speech, because Marley's significance to Cyprus, and this I constantly explore this from my own musical work. We've got a saying that we've developed, which is one love, one Cyprus, which we wouldn't have made, we wouldn't have created without Bob Marley and Jamaica. And I think this saying, and I've seen this at demonstrations, musical events, people have turned it, we've developed songs like this. It's important that although Bob Marley never played in Cyprus, and he probably never visited Cyprus, as far as I know, maybe he had a stop at Nicosia airport at some point. I'm not sure. I've never got to the bottom of that mystery. But his music inspires us and helps us heal and survive the ravages of war, conflict, oppression, division, and it gives us a vision for a united island. And that inspiration, just like the inspiration he gave to Jamaica for a united island, across its own very divisive political terrain, is very important to understand, because Marley's got a universality that a lot of artists don't have. And that universality is that he's an outer nationalist. His philosophy is beyond the concept of the nation. And that makes him a uniquely inspiring artist. As Marlon James wrote in 2014, in A Brief History of Seven Killings, which if you haven't read it, please read it. It's a most amazing novel. And it's largely based on the assassination attempt on Marley's life. Although he doesn't use the word Marley, he actually calls him the singer throughout the book. It's a very interesting and inspiring book. Marlon James says, and this is an award-winning Pulitzer Prize book, but in another city, another valley, another ghetto, another slum, another favela, another township, another intifada, another war, another birth, somebody is singing redemption song, as if the singer wrote it for no other reason but for this sufferer to sing, shout, whisper, weep, bawl, and scream right here, right now. And I think that's really important that we have that perspective about Marley, what he actually means politically with a small p. I also want to make something clear from the outset, and I will say this every time I talk about this book. I never met Bob Marley. I never saw him live. Many people I know saw him live. I don't consider myself to be a trained spotting expert on Bob Marley. A lot of people do. I think that's great, and they contribute a lot to our knowledge about him. But everything I know about Bob Marley, I experienced through text. I experienced through conversations, and in the widest sense of the word, through cultural content, through stories, insights, narratives, all kinds of stuff that I've heard from people. Everyone in Jamaica has a Bob Marley story to tell. You know, even at the presentation I did in Jamaica, the person who was the equivalent of Nicholas tonight, who was sort of like coordinating the presentation, actually had her own very special Bob Marley to tell, and that was that her mother actually interviewed him for TV, which I didn't know about this interview. So it was a big revelation for me, and it's an interview that isn't even really online. You have to dig very deep to find it. But I think it's important to understand this, that everything in the book is based on media content. And media content that largely up till now has not been reviewed or critiqued. Our point is most of these media texts are out there, but very few people have actually said anything about them beyond, oh, that's fantastic, it's an interview with Bob Marley, you know, it's great that he was interviewed on Canadian TV or in New Zealand, or all the places that you can find him, all the footprints online. So when preparing the concept for a book on Bob Marley, I gave a lot of thought to this point. And after examining some of this information, reviewing it, largely I started mainly with radio content, I was really astonished by the fact that nobody had actually talked about it. You know, none of the books that had been distributed had mentioned any of these interviews or any of this media content. So a lot of this stuff is seen, unfortunately, as kind of divine content. You know, even I could show you, I'm not really going to show you interviews and things tonight. It would just be too long because some of the interviews are 20 minutes and stuff like that. But even content that is very derogatory, a lot of people say, oh, it's great, Bob Marley was interviewed on Canadian TV. But, you know, the person doing the interview was just calling him a drug dealer or a gangster or something like this, which I find a bit problematic, you know, as coming from a media studies background. And so a lot of this stuff is out there and it's shared and reshared, and in the social media age, it's edited, it's put on TikTok, little short snippets here and there. What did Bob Marley think about money? Bang, you know, you can find it on TikTok with 20 million views or something. But very few people, you know, tend to understand that where did this come from? All right, it is a rare interview. It is a documentary based around or narrating about Rastas in the 1970s. But nobody has criticized this content. So my approach is very different, very critical and inquisitive. And it invites us really to understand Bob Marley in a different kind of way, in the way of how he was represented in the 1970s, which is the prime decade of his musical achievements. And I think this is important because it's often, as Dennis said earlier on in his introduction, that it's often the case that we seem to think Bob Marley got an easy ride, you know. He became famous, and that's all we know, you know. We only know Bob, a lot of people, unfortunately, only know Bob Marley through the Legend album. And I think that's a bit problematic, you know. There was a lot of things that happened in the 70s and in the 60s, not just to Bob Marley, but to the Wailers as a whole, which were very surprising to me and very shocking. Before I go into the content, though, I would like to just tell you a couple of stories. That this is my Essex story. Did anybody study at Essex tonight? No, there isn't. No. All right, I can say it then. No, it's a great place to study. Quite depressing, though. If you look at these buildings, these are the towers, right? And I was there from 1979 to 1984. I did a bachelor's degree and a master's degree at Essex. Essex was famous for its radicalism in the late 60s. I was there in a, as Nicos said, I was in that sort of transition period. Thatcherism, it was a very different time. The miners' strike, the steel workers' strike, it was a very radical place to be at that time. Afterwards, my last year there, John Bercow was there, who later became the Speaker of the House of Parliament. So unfortunately, after I left, it became very conservative and changed completely its political direction. But it was a really interesting place. And on 11th of May, 1981, I walked through the campus, going through these very concrete towers that we lived in, and we entered an events room, and a sonic boom permeated through my bones. Reggae sound systems have always had that effect on me, with a deep bass from a wall of speakers stacked to the ceiling, with the DJ's voice wailing something over the speakers, where he was basically saying, Bob Marley dead and gone, but his memory lives on. This is how I found out Bob Marley had died, through a sound system from Ipswich called Jahama Hi-Fi in a function room behind the Student Union bar. And ever since then, sound system has been a very important part of my life, as well as reggae music generally. There was something very crucial in hearing this sad news through this medium. It was very unfiltered, very raw. And in the days to come, this is all a long time before the internet, the news would spread through the media. And the news didn't spread instantly back then, but it would spread through television, radio, newspapers and magazines, and it was processed, manufactured, canned like a tin of baked beans. And Marley's death was actually a very big media moment. That is actually one of the most significant things, which could be a book in itself, I think, the way it was covered by the international press, the way it was covered by the Jamaican press. But more or less the same day, this news spread throughout the world's different time zones. And at that time, as a student, and you know, I was just finishing my first degree, so I hadn't really started engaging with cultural studies back then. I was between sociology and government. The thing that really amazed me the most was, although I heard this on a sound system, one thing that plagued me was I'd never seen Bob Marley on television in Britain. I'd seen him on Top of the Pops miming. I'd seen him, and that's what everybody did on Top of the Pops, by the way. And Marley didn't actually like that. He's on record in the book of saying that. And I'd seen parts of the old Grey Whistle test where he played live as the Wailers in the early 70s. But I've never heard him interviewed in depth anywhere on shows like, say, Parkinson, which was a famous chat show late at night, on which many pop stars were on. David Bowie, Mick Jagger, Grace Jones, all these sort of people were on these shows very regularly. And it kind of planted the seed in my mind that inspired this book, that aroused my curiosity. I think a lot of research we do is inspired by those moments. I think, you know, some curiosity in your mind sort of thinks, I wonder why that happened. I wonder why I never heard Bob Marley on the radio except for once on David Rodigan on Capital Radio in 1980. Or I wonder why I'd never seen Bob Marley on television. Obviously, I'd seen him in loads of, you know, music magazines and stuff like that. But I'll come to that in a moment. So that was the kind of seed for this book in a way, and it does go back a long way. But I always had this on my mind, and I think part of the problem is that a lot of people don't see Marley as a mainstream artist, and I think this is a very political thing, and it's something that he lived through even during his lifetime. If you take this little fascinating contradiction into account, in 1980, Marley did a very significant series of concerts. He played the Zimbabwe independence celebration in April. He then played the San Siro in Italy, which was at that time the biggest rock concert ever. There was over 100,000 people at this concert in Italy. And then the last one that he played in Europe, which was equally contentious politically, was Dublin. And he played Dublin at the height of the Troubles in Ireland. Now, a lot of these gigs that he did because he wanted to do them. He didn't do them because the record company, you know, Marley always wanted to do what he wanted to do. But if we take the San Siro gig, he played to over 100,000 people. But yet when he went back to England, he was playing places like New Bagley Working Men's Club in Staffordshire, which probably fits 500 people. So it gives you an indication of how he was excluded in that mainstreamness. Marley may have played the Rainbow, he played the Lyceum, but beyond that, he never played big venues in the UK. which should lead us to ask questions about this whole perception of Marley not being mainstream enough. That there was clearly something going on, which lasts till today, because even in trying to get a publishing deal for this book, I had my own experience of this kind of drama. I ran, usually when you're publishing a book, you might go through different publishers. It's a bit of a struggle always to get books published, especially academic books. But when I came up with this idea of writing a book and writing a proposal, you know, for any kind of book is like writing a PhD proposal, but you also have to have a marketing plan in it. So, you know, what do we know about, what do academics know about marketing? Very little, frankly. But we have to know, unless we're teaching marketing, that's a different story. Some of us are and some of us aren't. But a lot of the time, most academics ain't got a clue about marketing, much in the same way that most musicians haven't got a clue about marketing. So in putting this proposal together, the second publisher I approached, the first one just got lost in COVID. It was just that time when everybody was in lockdown, and I sent 20 emails and then concluded that this is a dead end, you know, it's pointless. But the second one I approached, I actually published a book on Marley, and it was also an academic book. So I thought, well, this seems like a good idea. And I sent the proposal in, and they replied, this sounds interesting, but we're afraid it's too specialized for our current commissioning. Now, when I heard this, normally, you know, when we get peer reviewed by someone, we have to accept the fact that our work may be inadequate or might have some problems or might need improvement. Or if we don't want to accept that, you know, then we don't publish it. It's as simple as that. If you want to stand by what you believe in, you know, if someone's telling you to change your perspective completely, then I'd advise you not to, you know. But if you want to get something published and there are faults in what you've sent, you should improve it. But in this case, it's the only time in my academic career that I've responded to a peer review by simply saying, I don't understand how somebody who sold 75 million records is too specialized for you. It doesn't make any sense. And this is part of the problem with Bob Marley. We all think he's mainstream, but in reality, just like reggae, he's not mainstream. Reggae is just as mainstream as rock music. Reggae is just as mainstream as house music. Reggae is just as mainstream as any kind of mainstream music. There's a lot of people who don't like that, who make reggae, who want to stay underground, just like the same with hip hop. But that's fine, that's their choice. But to not treat a music with respect that came from this island in the Caribbean and went all over the world is very irritating to me, not just as an academic, but it's very irritating as well as a DJ and as a reggae lover. And it's something that I've encountered for many decades, really, about this music. So I want to turn a little bit more to the actual content of the book. My first sort of starting point was radio, and I wrote a journal article for a very acclaimed academic called Professor Mike Hajimichael, who's based at the University of Tennessee. And I started off with radio mainly because it's my medium. It's the medium that I've been most engaged with as a radio person over the last, well, quite a long time actually, from about 1980 when I was a student. And when I started developing this chapter, it became very clear to me that Marley only had a handful of interviews in the UK, which I found very surprising. And in Jamaica, he only had around 4, which were also released as vinyl records. And Marley didn't like that, and he put a stop to them as well, because he didn't like the fact that he was being exploited in that way, commercialized. In the USA, there's a lot more, mainly because of the popularity of campus-based student radio, where Marley was, you know, like, it was like a magnet, you know. These were the generation of people in the 70s who could identify with reggae, and many of them went on to become, you know, very serious DJs, very serious writers, journalists, and leading Marleyologists. One of these is my dear friend Roger Steffens, who also played a very instrumental part in developing this book. He was based in California. But one thing I noticed with the radio content is when Marley was included on the mainstream, he was treated in a very trivialized way on radio. You know, the radio interviews are, don't people look at you strangely when you walk down the street in Jamaica because of your hair, and things like this, which I find a bit odd, really. Someone asking Bob Marley this question in 1980 on a mainstream radio station in Miami. One of the most interesting things I came across about radio was how he was limited on radio. The gong is actually Bob Marley's Jamaican nickname. It's very difficult to explain what it means, but Marley was had a very small stature, quite a small person, but he had a very big presence, and he had this reputation as the gong in the Wailers. That was his kind of nickname. And I came across a really interesting phenomenon that was brought to my attention by an acclaimed music critic called John Tobler, who wrote for music magazines in the 70s, 80s, 90s. In the 70s, John Tobler had 3 interviews commissioned via Island Records for the BBC, for BBC Radio. And these interviews were never played on air at the time due to the way the singer spoke, due to his accent, because it was not acceptable to the BBC. Tobler stated to me himself in an interview in 2018, Bob was not used on Radio 1 because it was felt that his Jamaican patois would not be comprehensible to many listeners. Effectively, this form of xenoglossophobia by the BBC went unnoticed at the time. Tobler released the interviews himself on, I think, on vinyl or CD, and kept telling this story of how these interviews were never played. So there was this website, it's still there actually, John Tobler's, Marley interviews. And at some point, a few decades later, the BBC finally played them, which is a bit disappointing really, because they should have been played in the 1970s. So there is this evidence of mainstream radio kind of limiting Bob Marley in that way. I think the television is just as bad, if not worse, in that sense, because Marley was mainly included by kind of like specialist television shows, programs that excluding him were mainly mainstream channels, specifically in the UK, where he was never interviewed on television. And this is one of the main findings of my book in terms of the content. And I find this very disturbing, really, considering how popular he was in the UK, that nobody actually interviewed him on TV. Obviously, as I said, when he died, everybody was talking about him. And when he got shot in the mid, about 77, again, everybody was talking about him, but there's no evidence that Marley was interviewed on television. And I only found I found one interview, or no, I didn't find it actually. I heard about it through Roger Steffens, who told me about an interview that Marley did in the 1960s with a man called Neville Willoughby, who was a Jamaican TV and radio producer, who later interviewed Marley for radio. And there was this TV program that he made. It was called Ride Me Donkey, I think it was. And it was actually filmed in Marley's village with the Wailers, because he was going through this phase as a group. They were going through this phase at the time where they were so disappointed with the local music industry that they wanted to go back and work on the land and become farmers. So this TV crew made a documentary about an interview with them. And this piece of Jamaican television history, unfortunately, was never archived. It doesn't exist, because the TV stations in Jamaica couldn't afford to do that. as part of the neo-colonial legacy, I guess. And there's another interview that, as I said earlier, I came across when I was in Jamaica through the person that was introducing the 26th Bob Marley lecture. And that interview, I've just seen it recently because it was sent to me through Dennis. And it's quite an interesting interview, and I plan to include that. But even so, 2 interviews in Jamaica is a little bit strange. You know, it does appear to be strange, and it's part of, generally, the Rastas were excluded from television in Jamaica for a very long time, from the 60s. And there's many instances of this, which I recall in the book. I found a number of themes on television, which are basically, the key themes are about hostility. Some interviews are very hostile. Many interviews are very naive. There's a lot of trivialization. There's a lot of irrelevant analogies. There's even content that is faked, completely faked. Like Dan Rather, who was an American journalist, made a documentary called 60 Minutes. In 2013, he made another thing which he shared online, which basically said, I never met Bob Marley. I tried to talk to him. We was there, you know, for the time period. He never talked to me. And when he came out of the front door eventually, his words are, he had this big joint in his mouth like this. He was really exaggerating it. And he just derricked, you know, he literally fell flat on his face. And he says this online. You can see it online in 2013. But when you watch the actual documentary, he's shaking hands with him in the documentary. He's filming him playing football, but he never interviewed him. Now, I don't know, you know, this is an example of faked news, really. But I mean, why he did it, I don't know. I think a lot of people do these things for the hits. You know, I can't think of any other reason for doing it. I think the reason he didn't interview him was Bob Marley didn't want to be interviewed, because in the first 60 Minutes, which was with an Australian man called Nicos, it was a terrible interview. And so he didn't like it. And he wanted so much money that the TV company wasn't willing to pay it. So he didn't do the second 60 Minutes program. So there's a lot of other examples as well of what I would call good and bad journalistic practice. You know, in teaching a course like, say, music journalism and how to do interviews with musicians, I would develop a course like this and try and share with my students what's a good way to interview an artist and what's a bad way to interview an artist. And I've experienced both sides of the fence as an artist and as an interviewer. So I've got a lot of insight about this because I've done some really great interviews with people, and I've been interviewed by some very great people, but I've also been interviewed by people who don't know nothing about me. And yet they say, tell us about your new album, please. You know? And I think, did you hear it? No, I didn't. Oh, all right. But why am I doing the interview? So there's a lot of things that are good practice and bad practice. And this is very evident in the televised content on Marley, surprisingly. There's a lot of interviews where people just haven't got a clue what they're doing. You know, they're completely out of their depth. And I think Marley knew that as well. And he was very sharp in that sense. I'll come back to that in a minute. The third main area of media content is what the papers say. And I must confess here that this was the most challenging, difficult mission, because this is the big one. And I have to say, I didn't really know where to start with it, because I found about 1,000 articles on Marley, and you can't really do a media analysis of 1,000 articles. It's extremely difficult. And so I took a sample of 100 of these and did an in-depth coding analysis, which enabled me to understand better the different themes that emerged around Marley as an artist and as a person. I think this is probably, for me, it was the most difficult chapter to write, definitely the most time-consuming. And I developed this coding tree out of it, which I show my students in classes, and they think, we've got to do this, you know. I'm just giving it as an example of what a coding tree would look like in terms of media content. And this taught me a lot, really, about the content. You know, the print print media is a mine, it's a gold mine really about Bob Marley, which you don't find on television and you don't find in radio. And there's two generic codes, which is the critique, how you look at the artist, his reviews, his concert reviews, his features, which are both positive and negative. The theme of mainstreaming, there's an ethnographic element that comes out through language, which I'll explain in a minute. There are very thick ethnographic details, which some people achieved really well as music journalists, especially a man called Lester Bangs, who was quite famous as a gonzo music journalist in the USA, who wrote for a magazine called Cream. His success, which is something Nicos touched on, how a country boy makes it into a big international icon, from going downtown to uptown. His beliefs is a very important part of it, because I think a lot of people understood him, but also I think a lot of journalists misunderstood him. And the whole theme of mythologization, which is a very big theme when it comes to Marley. His deification after he died, for example, and the first third world superstar to conquer the first world, which I've always found to be a problematic kind of analysis. And of course, the CIA and Marley, which is a very interesting topic. There's a theory about how the CIA killed Bob Marley. They allegedly spiked his training shoe with cancer. And he put his shoe on and he caught cancer. And this is such a ridiculous theory. And even with today's technology, it's not possible, as we know. But some people still believe it, sadly. There is one man, I can't remember his name, he's passed away now. He was saying repeatedly that he was the CIA agent who was behind the killing of Bob Marley. And then I think on his deathbed, he confessed that none of this was actually true. So there are a lot of conspiracy theories about Marley too. And a lot of people do buy into this, unfortunately. Must say though, and this is very important to stress, there is a huge file in the CIA about Bob Marley. I'm not in any way underestimating the fact that the Central Intelligence Agency didn't keep a good tab on Bob Marley, simply because he wrote a song with a lyric that said, "Rasta don't work for no CIA." That makes you a target for the CIA, I guess. And I'm sure there's a big one on me somewhere as well, in our own CIA in Cyprus. And then we have the personal life. Well, this is complicated, really, but it is very interesting. His personal life, his relationships with women, and that's one of the most talked about things. And there's a lot of people who misconstrue this completely because they don't really understand Marley's relationships. And also marriage in the Caribbean has got a very different meaning from what it means in Cyprus, I think. I'll just leave that one there. Miss World and the Wild Man is a very important theme in this, which I'll illustrate in a bit. And Miss World is Cindy Breakspear. She won it in 1975. And no, later than 75, sorry. Cindy Breakspear is actually Damian Marley's mother. His family background is interesting because it wasn't really talked about, but it came out eventually. His background. His father was an Englishman who married his mother. I'm not sure if they ever got married. I'm sure they did. I don't know. His father was about 60 at the time. His mother was about 18, and she was living in a village called 9 Mile. And it's a very he basically never really saw his father beyond twice, I think. And when he started becoming famous, he tried to reconnect with his father's side of the family, but they didn't want to know him. And they were based in England. After he died, of course, everyone says, "I'm Bob Marley's stepbrother, I'm Bob Marley's cousin, I'm this." Everybody wanted a piece of the action, I guess. But it's an interesting thing, his family background, and it's something that needs more research. The shooting is very important. It's a very significant media moment. Mainly, what were the causes? It was a bad betting deal. it was based around political sectarianism between the major parties, or it's a complete mystery, which is never really been answered. In some interviews, Marley says, I don't know who shot me. In one specific interview, which is an excellent interview by Gil Noble, he says, yes, I know who they were. So, you know, I actually say in the book that I don't really understand why there hasn't been an independent inquiry about the shooting of Bob Marley, you know, by the Jamaican state. It's a mystery to me. His exile in London is very interesting. He produced some of his great works while in London, Exodus and Kaya, and also his reasons for returning to Jamaica. And finally, cancer and his death, which is a very significant thing in terms of media coverage. And his eventual deification. You know, after he died, everybody wanted to talk about Bob Marley. Everybody wanted to tell their Marley story. Marley's songs weren't really played in Jamaica before he died. I find this quite an unusual thing, you know. And this is something that Dennis told me as well. Many Jamaicans have told me. I think the media content on newspapers is extremely interesting. And as I said, it's very data rich. And I think one of the key things about it is there's a lot of self-reflection. There's a lot of different types of media. There's mainstream media, there's music magazines, there's specialist media, black media, different texts, different representations, full of surprises, including Playboy, which, believe it or not, did a concert review on Marley. I had a big conversation about this when it landed on my doorstep with my wife. You know, why are you ordering all these old copies of Playboy? I also had a big conversation when I brought it into the office, and various colleagues coming into my office and saying, why have you got an old copy of Playboy on your desk? I'm doing research, you know. But it's I couldn't find it anywhere online. I found it on eBay. So I bought. Now, the thing is, online you find it, but you only find a segment of it. You can't do an analysis of one paragraph. It's over 2 pages as well. The interesting thing about Playboy is not so much, all right, it is interesting that it was in Playboy, and it shows you how mainstream Marley was in the mid-70s. But it's also interesting to know that in the top corner of this, I think it's that one, isn't it? Yeah. In the top corner of this, you see this part here, Bob Marley, the Prophet, is actually that article in Playboy reproduced without the expletives, because there's 2 swear words at the end of it. And I'm sure it was written by Hugh Hefner, but I can't prove it, because it's an anonymous writer. Tabloids are very interesting because, as I told you, he had a long-standing relationship with Cindy Breakspear, who became Miss World. I got the date wrong before. It's in 1976. So this is where the title of the lecture comes from in Jamaica, because a lot of people were thinking, what's he talking about? The wild man of pop, you know? What's Bob Marley got to do with pop? But this is what the newspaper was actually saying, not me. This is the Daily Mirror, front page. The only time Marley made the front page of the Daily Mirror on 2 occasions was this. Miss World's wild man. I have 9 children by 7 girls, he claims in the first article. And in this article, he's also, of course, Marley wasn't interviewed in this, nor Cindy Breakspear. So it's all hearsay. It's a gossip, you know, tabloid newspaper, still is. And basically, the newspaper claims that Marley's going to divorce his wife for Miss World. In between these 2 articles, right, something happens. Someone tries to shoot Bob Marley in 1976. And here, it's very clear that Miss World goes into hiding. Miss World had a lot of, when anyone becomes Miss World, became Miss World, I think it still goes on. I don't know. When Cindy Breakspear became Miss World, like all Miss World winners, 365 days of that year, they have philanthropic commitments to do. So Miss World can't just disappear for 3 weeks, but she did. And it's claimed that she went into hiding to her wild man of pop on some little remote island somewhere. This was actually a complete lie. She did actually go and see him, but she was also with a lot of other people seeing him after the shooting. And then those people went from, I think it was Nassau, where the owner of Island Records, Chris Blackwell, had a house. And they went from there and they stayed in London. It's just interesting, you know, the mainstream tabloid representation is radically different from anything else I've ever come across. And it was, as I said, the only time Marley made it. Of course, a lot of the time, Marley was featured a lot in music magazines, in Cream. This is a very interesting article from Lester Bangs on, it's called Innocence in Babylon. And it's also featured in this very interesting compilation called Every Little Thing Gonna Be All Right, the Bob Marley Reader, which is a collection of probably about 60, 70 articles mainly from media, but also from people that lived with him on the road and stuff. It's very interesting. And you can find this online, downloadable as a PDF. And this is actually a big collection of print articles that I use quite a lot in my research, along with another really good source called Rock's Back Pages, which is a fantastic place for finding old interview content. The issue of language of Marley, it does come out on television and radio, but in print media, the difference is we start to understand how Marley was excluded and misunderstood in depth. There is this evidence in television and radio of xenoglossophobia, but in print media, this is expressed in a reflexive manner. In other words, journalists doing interviews in groups with Marley, Lester Bangs was one of these, he actually observed that people in the group, who were journalists from the USA, didn't actually understand what he was saying. And they were asking very naive questions. Another take on this, which is from a documentary was made more recently that features Bob Marley's son, Ziggy Marley, with, I think it was someone from the Wailers, I can't remember his name. And they were discussing this idea that Bob Marley actually had a BS meter when it came to language. And this was basically when he realized somebody didn't understand him, he spoke deliberately more patois, so they wouldn't understand him anymore. And I found this quite an interesting theory. And I've witnessed this actually myself. When interviewing Jamaican artists, I was interviewing a dancehall artist once called Cutty Ranks. He's quite a famous dancehall artist, and afterwards we became very good friends. And there was a gentleman from the Times. Now the Times is not where, in 1990, the Times was not writing about dancehall reggae artists. It was like, it was a strange year really, because all of a sudden all these artists started to get signed to major labels, and so all the media wanted to talk to them. And there was this person of probably English descent or something, who looked very middle class and quite scared, because it was in Brixton, and it was in a wine bar in Brixton. It was daytime, and we were sitting around the table, and this gentleman said to me, "Do you mind awfully if I sit through your interview? Because I don't understand the chaps." And I said, "No problem, you can sit here, it's fine." I put my tape recorder on, and when Cutty Ranks came, he looked at the two of us around the table, looked us straight in the eyes, and spoke exactly like I'm going to speak to you now, Nicos. "My name is Cutty Ranks. I come from the ghetto." And this gentleman just got up and left. Literally, he went as white as a sheet. He didn't know how to react. And I thought, oh yeah, great, I've got your first record, Gunman lyrics. And that was it. We became great friends. Because he connected with me because I connected with him. But there was a disconnect. And that was about language and culture. So when you send people on a mission to interview people for your publication, they've got to know what they're talking about. Much in the same way if someone's going to interview Julio and they haven't heard any of his tracks and they can't speak his language, all right, he speaks perfect English, but if you don't understand the man's lyrics, how are you going to do an interview with him? You know, so it's really important to understand language and the significance of language. And taking this a step further, I think this is also important to how Marley was perceived. And there's a really excellent obituary, which you can find online, by Neil Spencer, who was writing, he's a very acclaimed writer, Neil Spencer, who was writing for NME. He was actually the editor of NME much later on. And he says in this obituary, he was made to suffer in the interviews for his adherence of Rasta dogma, though few of his attackers possessed the underlying spirituality that animated his beliefs. The present writer remembers seeing Marley under attack in a German hotel from prosaic German radio interviewers pressing home questions about Haile Selassie's bank account. Marley responded, "Why you no check the heart that beats inside instead of the bank account?" And it seemed then that whatever his failings, Marley was more on the side of life than the grey rationalists who pursued him. And this was an obituary. Spencer's reflection represents a form of critique to his contemporaries in music journalism, which is an admirable trait. He highlights a form of bad practice noticeable in numerous interviews across a wide range of media. And I've seen this in many interviews. I've seen it in a Spanish interview with Bob Marley. I've seen it in loads of other interviews with him as well, where people completely misconceive his beliefs. It's also important to understand how he resisted being misrepresented. There was a very well-known reggae journalist who sadly died in the UK called Penny Real, who recalls a time when Marley refused to perform at Admiral Ken's Bouncing Ball Club in Peckham, London in 1973. So this is quite early on in his international development, because the manager of the club took down the promotional posters due to the weed content that those posters contained. I think it was the Burning album, which had the famous Zippo cover. I think it was that one. Was it Burning? No, I'm trying to remember what album was the. Anyway, it was an album where basically it was very clear what was going on the cover. And the Wailers reach up and set up on stage, as Penny Real recalls. Seiko arranges his percussion tableau. Family Man takes his bass from its case. Bob arrives and immediately notices the missing posters. On hearing the reason why, he declares that a club that refuses to display the poster on its wall is a club that he, Bob Marley, refuses to grace with his presence, upon which he leaves. And the show never happened. It is important to note the date, 1973, the year the Wailers first toured Britain. There is somebody who turned up to do a gig, notices that he's been discriminated against in the absence of the posters promoting his tour, and leaves. That takes a lot of, that actually takes a lot of guts to actually do. Clearly, Bob was bothered by how the media represented him. This comes through in several other interviews where he philosophizes on how the media process things, and also he philosophizes on how the media is very controlled. I want to finish with the print content by referring to a very interesting time in Marley's life, 1978 to 1980. And during those years, statistically speaking, he did just under 140 of his total 270 live concerts that he did from 1972 to 1980. He did these concerts at a time when he had cancer, and it was very hush hush. Some people knew about cancer, but we as fans didn't know a thing about it. I think a lot of people in his immediate environment, the record company, it was diagnosed in 76, 77. But in this particular interview, after going through this very punishing tour schedule, in an interview conducted by Basil Wilson, it's actually the interview's in May 1978, and it was published in a magazine called Everybody's, which is a US Jamaican diasporic publication. Basil Wilson was actually a famous footballer long before Alan Skill Cole, and he later also became a professor. I think he's a professor emeritus now. He's retired. I think he's still alive. And this interview is very interesting because in the interview, Marley comes across as a very angry person. I didn't find this anywhere else in television or radio. And he describes how he feels about being run to the ground by the record label. And this is what Marley says. Hear what happened now. What happened to them is that they do not know what happened to them is that they do not want to run this thing like how I want to run it. They want to run me on a star trip. I'm not on any star trip. I want that any time I tour Europe and I look at myself and realize that my structure, my health, run down. I must rest. But they're not concerned with my structure. They run and plan a North American tour. And this interview is also full of quite a lot of expletives. He's actually swearing in this interview. In the print media, we find a lot of insights about what he was experiencing through this interview, the pressure he was under, which is completely absent from radio and television. In this particular interview, when I've discussed it with people, especially people who are experts on Bob Marley, it completely stuns them because it's an interview that a lot of people haven't come across. And because of his frankness and honesty, it gives an insight that is absent from all other media. And I came across this, frankly, through an article that was published by a very acclaimed professor, Caroline Cooper, who's now Professor Emeritus. She's the former head of the Institute of Caribbean Studies at the University of West Indies. When I go to Kingston, I usually stay with Caroline. She's a fascinating woman and a very dynamic woman. And I really want to thank her again for this article because it was really important to discover this magazine. So print media offers us a completely different insight. I want to just briefly talk about something that Nicos spoke about Dapi Conqueror. And I think this is probably, it's almost like, it's the chapter that I wrote that probably has a lot less to do with media analysis, but more to do with Marley's posthumous existence after he died. And this relates a lot to a thing that Gilroy defines as hyper-commodification, which I find really interesting, especially through Buffalo Soldier, which is a lecture in itself, and I'm not going to do it now. But Buffalo Soldier is a song that Marley didn't actually write himself. It was written by a man called King Sporty. Marley liked the song and then adapted it. It wasn't originally a reggae song. If I can define the music, it was kind of like a Eurobeat song, a little bit kind of funky, I guess, but not quite James Brown funky, but interesting. But it wouldn't be the song that I would think, oh, that's a great song. But Marley really liked it and he adapted it. And it was actually released after he died. It wasn't a song that was mixed when he was alive. The making of legend and its manufacturing, the role that Dave Robinson played in this, who was the formerly owned Stiff Records. And they did focus groups with mainly white suburban participants around London. And this is highlighted by Cornelis. It was a very interesting article about how legend is basically the remanufacturing of Bob Marley. How there's no really militant songs on it, except for Get Up, Stand Up. And I think this is important to take into account. I used to actually like Buffalo Soldier when I was a student. I can't stand it anymore. I like the dub, but when I read the background of the story, I just went off it completely. There's something about it. And it's also the content of the song, semiotically, what it's actually talking about, which, as I said, I think is a lecture in itself. So I haven't got enough time for it. Marley remixed and rehashed all these problematic remixes of Marley, even down to what is very severely critiqued by Michael Lean, which is the pitch tuning of Marley's voice. Why in the hell anybody pitch tunes Marley's voice? I don't know. This means you change the actual tune of somebody's voice so it can match the beat of the house music. If Constantinos is holding his head down like this, it is sacrilege. I agree with you, my brother. It is terrible that songs like this have been made. Some of them are interesting. I'm not saying they're all terrible, but I think there's something fundamentally wrong in this age when people let the machines do the singing. And it's a very unique legacy that you can't find anywhere else. If you name me any other popular music icon with the legacy of Bob Marley, there's no one like him. His grandchildren are making music, you know, his children are making music. There's something really important to all that. And the fact that we're going to carry on interpreting him, we've got different approaches. We will interpret him hermeneutically ad infinitum. You know, he is somebody that will always be interpreted in different ways. I think, you know, I want to leave it there, really. I just want to say that it's important that we do more studies on Marley, and people will carry on interpreting him. What media represents and how is really important. It's important to emphasize that he was a creator, an artist, an interviewee, a revolutionary, an intellectual, an organic intellectual, and basically a very everyday person as well, which I find really a side of him that a lot of people tend to overlook. And I will just end on the phrase by Bob Marley, one good thing about music, when it hits you, you feel no pain. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was really insightful and enlightening, and it's really a good thing that Marley's music managed to transcend beyond the political, cultural, racial, media borders of the time, and that's because of his talent, of course. As I understand, the pizzas have arrived.
Yeah, I'm sorry I talked too much.
But I think it's important that we do open this up. If there are any questions for the author, for Dr. Hajimichael, or indeed for Nicos as well, for his book review. Are there any questions or anything you'd like to share as well? Yes, Menelaos, please get up, stand up, get up, stand up.
So I got a question. For example, do you think Bob Marley would have thrived in our generation because there is more access to, you know, the media, and maybe he could take advantage of it and make reggae a more mainstream, you know, genre of music?
I don't know. I think in your generation now, when somebody's going to make a hit, they have to have a TikTok account. So in the first 20 seconds, if the song is catchy, the record company will release it. Bob Marley came from a generation of people like Bob Dylan, Carlos Santana, Bruce Springsteen, many people of that generation. Record companies invested huge budgets. I wouldn't say they invested as much in Bob Marley as they did in David Bowie or many other pop acts, but you know, Chris Blackwell took a risk with the Wailers when he signed them. Today, I don't think that happens. I think a lot of young people are kind of chasing this illusion of being a star on TikTok, and I don't really understand it, even though I teach it. You know, I don't really understand it. I think though that his music is very important to young people today. And I think his music, just like the music of John Lennon, say, and various other people of that era, David Bowie, you know, there's loads of artists from that time who are, you know, real legacy artists. And a lot of young people discovering this music who never heard, say, Redemption song before, suddenly discover this song and think, oh, wow, you know, they don't make music like this anymore, you know. So I think it's a different time now, the way music is shared. Although I do agree with you that in some ways it is a lot easier to get your songs out there and stuff like that. But I don't think the investment is there in the same way that it was in the 70s.
So it might actually suppress.
I don't think, I just don't think it's, I think, you know, when Marley came out, he came out in a particular time from a particular location. And that context played a very important role in his success. And more than anything, I would say his hard work played a more important role. That very punishing schedule 3 years before he died, 51% of his concerts, in knowing that you've got cancer, but you're still carrying on. I mean, we're talking about somebody who literally just couldn't do his last gig, because he'd collapsed in the park the day before. So I think it's a different kind of approach to music, really.
Anyone else?
I have one question. Mike, how did you pick up the 100 among the 1,000?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. I chose, I must say, I chose mainly music magazines. Mainly music magazines, because it's very difficult to find mainstream media representation. And I came across those things from Daily Mirror purely by the fact that, let me see how they represented his shooting. And I completely came across that by accident. So a lot of it was music content. It was mainly British, American, and very few Jamaican. There was only one Jamaican music magazine called Swing. So most of it, and obviously one of the biggest drawbacks of my work is it's a very Anglophone approach. Marley was interviewed in French, in German, in Norwegian, in Spanish, which I could translate, because I had a student at the time who was on an internship, and she assisted me with the translation. And in Italy as well. So there's a lot of content that's difficult to analyze for me, but largely through collecting stuff through a webpage called Rock's Back Pages, which has got quite a lot of data on Marley and a lot of other famous popular music artists, and my own collection that I've collected as well.
Did you reach a conclusion why he was not on TV?
Well, I think a lot of the time people on television at the time saw him as a threat. The woman who interviewed him in Canada, Sandy Ronaldo, it's a very shocking interview. You can find it on my webpage, on the section on hajimike.com. There's a section on Bob Marley and media. If you scroll down, I was going to show it tonight, but it's quite long. She actually says after post, 30 years later, 40 years later, the director was actually telling me in the ear what to do, because they wanted me to be hard on him, because his way of life posed a threat at the time.
Like a revolution.
Yeah, and the questions were, it's a very uncanny link with Stuart Hall, which is what I talked about more when I was in Jamaica. The actual things Stuart Hall was talking about academically, about the British state and stereotyping, this journalist was actually doing it on Marley, this whole moral panic about Rastafarians. Yeah.
A couple more, yeah.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much and congratulations on the book. I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thank you.
I have like a million points and a million questions, and I understand we don't have the time. Just a very quick one, since we make this parallel, this analogy with Cyprus today, but it's basically a question in two parts. First of all, do you think that studying media in retrospect, right, as kind of in a sense, and from the lens of today and from the knowledge we have from cultural studies and so on, and the legacy of Bob Marley all around the world, has kind of diffused or directed the way we interpret, because these articles and these shows and these non-interviews were happening at a certain time and context. And reading those, a bit in retrospect from the point of today, how that might have affected our understanding of the whole point today. And when we are engaged in research, where we have to read media of today for artists of today, like Julio and many, many other people who deal with this kind of art forms today, and realizing the exclusion, the non-exclusion, or various types of sensationalist representation. How can we deal with that? And that's much more like an advice that I'm asking from you right now
Well,
in relation also to the Bob Marley?
The first question really is, I understand what you mean, and I think it's true. I also think then that means if we accept that, we can't look at anything from 40 years ago that was in the media. So I think one of the reasons why I did this was because it hadn't been done. So I felt that there was a need for it, seeing the content, viewing it, and thinking, I don't understand why nobody's talked about this. Yeah, no. I understand what you mean, though, because I think you do need to understand it in the context. But there's a lot of media content. There's a really fascinating writer called Carl Gale, who's actually based in Britain, he's Jamaican origin. He did this six-part report on black music in the UK in the early 70s. And it was in a black music magazine. Now, when you read something like that, despite the fact that it was in the early 70s, despite the fact that you're talking about context, I actually felt when I was reading it, I was actually reading ethnography. So I think it's important to also not lose sight of what people are doing when they're writing about musicians. In certain ways, they're commentating, they're reflecting on things, and I think it's important that we can try and analyze that. But I'm not so sure about the second part of your question. I think sensationalism comes with the turf of being famous, and you can't really control what people say. And I think the only way you can control what people say about you in media is to literally say, I'm not doing any media. And I feel very strongly about this book in this way, actually. I only want to talk to people that have read the book. Because if I go on some breakfast show and they ask me a really irrelevant question, I'm liable just to get up and walk out. Because I don't see why I should sit there and be ridiculed as a writer. Because if you're going to be talking about something, the people that should be interviewing you, like the reason he knows so much about my book is he interviewed me on radio yesterday. So he had to read the book. And Nicos is a very rare journalist in that sense. He actually did his homework. I want to say a big thank you to him and Christos for that interview yesterday. And if it's the only radio interview I do in Cyprus, I'm very happy with it. Because I think it's very important to be understood than be ridiculed. And I think a lot of the time the media in Cyprus, unfortunately, especially about music, we haven't got in any way, shape or form qualified music journalists. There's very few people writing about music and musicians in a way that exists in other countries around the world.
But there's no outlets.
Well,
that's part of it.
That's also the perception of the people that own the newspapers, though. Yeah. They don't understand the value of music, popular music, I mean.
Can I just add one word here? The alternative answer is just to sell books. The alternative is you do it, you don't care whether they understand, you go and you say, you respect the question you're asked, you say your own thing, and you sell more books. That's the alternative answer.
If it works.
I think we'll take one more question.
We can carry on talking.
We can carry on because I can guarantee you that Mike is very approachable.
I don't care. No, one more. No.
Please.
Take them together.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Promising book, excellent book. I had a period question in relation with Rastafari movement, but I have changed. And now I'm interested about the influence in black community. I mean, you think it's still considered like a hero, sort of hero, but nowadays for black community, because black community used to listen a lot of reggae music. Now they share with rap. But what do you think on this issue?
I think if we're going to talk about Jamaica, when you go in Jamaica, literally the first thing you're going to see somewhere on the wall is Bob Marley. He's very revered in Jamaica, very respected. I think in Jamaica you come across, as I said, everybody's got a Bob Marley story to tell you. Even a taxi driver will tell you a Bob Marley story if they're old enough to remember it. If you're talking more about today's generation, I think it's a little bit different because I think a lot of music has kind of lost its way. And I think a lot of this is down to the fact that many people making what they consider to be commercial music are fooled by the machines. So one thing I don't understand is auto-tuning in music. You know, I don't understand it in reggae, period, because reggae is a kind of music where we have, you know, you have one rhythm and you have 20 people singing or chatting over it. And all 20 people are saying something different melodically, thematically, and everything like that. And reggae music's got that tradition. So why would 20 people want to sound like a chipmunk? I don't understand. Beyond the fact that somebody has said to them, this sells more than conventional reggae. And unfortunately, that's what's going on. I get sent, I wouldn't say dozens of songs every week, but I get sent a lot of songs every week. My first criteria is, is the person actually singing, or is it the machine? And if it's the machine, I don't play the music. I don't see it as reggae. Because for me, the important part of reggae is the message and the voice that's articulating it, and the character of the voice. Jamaica is a place of 1,000 voices, if not more, 1,000,000 voices. You know, everybody has got a different sound, a different voice. So it's a very special place musically. And I think the machines are destroying that, and the music producers, and the whole system of how to become famous nowadays.
Okay, and on that note, I think we should
Come next door, we can carry on. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.